Hello, welcome to the Dharma Gates podcast for anyone who is joining us. Today I'll be interviewing Megan Mook, who's a teacher in the Vajrayana tradition. She can share more about the particular location within the Vajrayana in a minute, but just that for now. And for context, my name is Aaron. I'm one of the founders of Dharma Gates. We're a 501(c)(3) that works to connect young people to the various traditions of Buddhist practice and deep meditation. Really, I think of our online offerings are available to anyone. Anybody can watch the podcast. And really, we want to help people find teachers, communities, and also context for the landscape of Buddhist practice in the US right now and globally. It's a complicated scene out there these days. And so hopefully this can be a helpful conversation in anyone's process of navigating the landscape of meditation and Buddhist practice. So I'll let you introduce yourself more long form in a moment, but I was connected to Megan through we have a partnership with Tricycle, or we had one last summer, and they recommended her very highly as a young teacher in the Vajrayana. And there's not that many young Buddhist teachers in general are by young under 60, and so um, someone who's bridging the world of the sort of more traditional forms of practice with bringing Vajrayana in particular, I think, faces the challenge of bringing the more traditional forms of practice into new environments and adapting it to reach new audiences and to be accessible to the younger generation. And so they recommended her, and we're really excited she's here. And maybe you can introduce yourself more fully. I wish I could do more justice to the complexity of like your position within the Vajrayana, but I still don't understand it, so I'm learning from you. So, um,
Yeah, sure.
maybe,
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, so my name's Megan Mook. I've been studying Buddhism for about 25 years. I started when I was in college. Um, and for me, well, the first thing I'll say is that so most of my training in both Tibetan Buddhism and in Vajrayana has been in what's called the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. So there's four schools of Tibetan Buddhism. They all have Vajrayana or Tantric lineages. The Gelug school is kind of best known because it's the Dalai Lama's lineage. And so most of my background's been in that. But now I'm starting to explore and study in some different Tibetan Buddhist lineages, namely the Kagyu and Nyingma lineages. So I'm not entirely sure if this is more stressed in the Gelug lineage than the other lineages, but certainly within the communities that I was kind of growing up in dharmically and practicing in, we never even called ourselves Vajrayana practitioners. It's so kind of secret and private that we would never call ourselves that or someone else that. And at least for me, I didn't really think of myself as a Vajrayana practitioner. What I've always thought of myself as is someone who practices the path of the bodhisattva and compassion. And then Vajrayana is just it's considered a more expedient or kind of skillful way of realizing the bodhisattva path. So that's always how I thought of it. So it's been a shift for me to start to kind of openly identify as a Vajrayana practitioner. And this is part of how it's changing in America. It's not so secretive. It's okay to say, yeah, I'm a Vajrayana practitioner. So anyway, I just wanted to call that out.
yeah. I noticed already that you separated the Tibetan Buddhist, practice from Vajrayana practice, and I'm curious, um, you know, how much is that? I went in my mind, I'm like, oh, Tibetan Buddhism is the Vajrayana, but is it actually thought of as separate, I think, within the tradition? And what is that distinction? What is it that makes something Vajrayana compared to, just Tibetan Buddhists, for example?
Yeah, so the way that the Tibetan Buddhist system is organized, and this is not necessarily how it's presented or practiced, but the way it's actually organized is it's on the basis of early Buddhism. So what we are sort of sometimes calling Theravada Buddhism right now, which isn't the most accurate term, but so that's the foundation. And within, early Buddhism, philosophically, we're working with ideas of impermanence and no self and suffering and just like very basic ethics. And there, the real emphasis is on learning how to control our actions of body, speech, and mind so that we don't harm others. So then from there, once that's stable, then there's this kind of opening, this flowering of what I referred to earlier as a bodhisattva intention, which is the desire to be of benefit to beings. And so that then we call that the Mahayana. And where Tibetan Buddhism, one of the ways that it really excels is that it has this vast sort of curriculum of how to train in being a bodhisattva. And it's basically a bunch of practices where you practice putting others above yourself as a way to break down your ego. Very, very beautiful practices. And then it's on that basis of the desire to be a benefit to beings, which we call compassion or an altruistic intention, that one may or may not enter the Vajrayana path. So the Vajrayana path is it's an entirely different set of methods, but it's all rooted in compassion. So some people don't get there because it's complicated and it requires really big thinking. And for some people, it just doesn't work or they're not drawn to it. But it's also, you're a little bit funneled into it. You kind of have to opt out, basically, rather than opting in a way. Does that make sense? The way it's
So you mean within the Tibetan Buddhist kind of tradition or world, you're kind of funneled that way?
I at least was funneled that
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Yeah. hmm So there are practitioners who never kind of formally take, I guess it would be Vajrayana or tantric kind of vows,
Ab-
but within the
abso-
Tibetan.
Absolutely.
hmm
Yeah. And there's also practitioners who might take it almost because it's just like part of the culture, like you show up and there's a tantric empowerment or ceremony or something. And they might take it, but never really do the practices.
hmm
Um, yeah,
hmm
some people take it just as a blessing. In fact, many Tibetans and Himalayan people in general, they're present at many of these tantric empowerments, but they never engage with the practices at all. And they don't even formally take the commitments within the ceremonies. Again, it's just a blessing to be there. And many people practice like that.
hmm hmm I'm curious, kind of in the arc of your practice, we sort of dove right into what is this whole territory of the Vajrayana, but was the Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana kind of practice? I'll say Tibetan Buddhism. Was that the first um, tradition you encountered, and was it immediately obvious to you, or how did you end up sort of in this part of the the landscape of Buddhist practice?
Yeah, it's interesting to me because my path is so intertwined with yoga.
Hmm.
So when I was in college, yoga wasn't a thing yet. And but there was a couple of my college peers who had just been trained as yoga teachers and they were teaching yoga classes out of the gym and we like did it all on wrestling mats. Like that's how there just like wasn't even yoga mats. It makes it sound like I'm really old. This is like 2000. um, and I was going to the yoga classes. I really liked it. And I asked the yoga teacher, can you teach me how to meditate? That's something I'm interested in. And he said, I can't because I'm not that good at it, but I learned at a Zen center in Berkeley, California. So I went to the Zen Center in Berkeley, California, and moved in for a month residency to learn how to meditate. So Korean Zen in the Rinzai tradition was my first exposure. And I was really lucky because we had the teacher there was a very well regarded master from Korea. And this little center in Berkeley was like his little outpost, his little like
Mhm.
American experiment. Um, so I got to live in a house with him and like three other people. And then in the Zendo, there's maybe five people who slept out there, kind of like novice monks. So I got this really close and intimate training from a Zen master. And so I did Zen for a few years. And then I kind of dropped my Buddhist practice. I was just post college and floating and doing all that kind of stuff. But I started doing yoga really, really, really intensely. And one of my yoga friends one day said, "Hey, there's a class in Tibetan Buddhism. It's starting tonight, and it's like a 6 year class. And you should really go to this first one because then you'll like get in on the cycle." And I was like, tonight, I don't know. I'm like busy, blah, blah, blah. But I went and I just absolutely fell in love with it because it was Gelug Buddhism, which is super scholastic and intellectual and philosophical. And I'd studied religious philosophy in college. So it was like a really good fit for me in terms of just
Mm.
philosophical thinking. Um, and so that's how I got into Tibetan Buddhism. And I mean, both, it was like Zen and Tibetan Buddhism both came through yoga.
Mm. We have some similar kind of roots. I got into practice through Ashtanga yoga and
Oh,
then
cool.
Zen. And I think one of the core things I've been wrestling with or encountering is that actually there's similar threads, there's similar roots between yoga, this Zen, Vajrayana, all have this sort of these similar esoteric threads that give them similar flavors in certain ways, but also very different. Well, I'm curious. So obviously, a lot has happened since you started going to that Gaelic center, and how did how has your practice kind of unfolded from there? And I imagine it has gone through ups and downs and kind of intensity or periods of retreat. And how did that end up happening, or how did it kind of play out? And I know you've transitioned to teaching as you're going to be leading a Dharma Gates retreat soon. And yeah, just sort of if maybe it'd be helpful to have a brief like summary of the your practice life and like what was it like? And I guess a particular question is so I've started exploring the Nyondro, the preliminary practices. I started doing some of them in the Dujam Tersar, which is a Nyingma school, and it's a crazy thing to do. And I'm just curious, yeah, did you do Nyondro and how was that too for you? Okay.
No, I
No.
didn't. No. Yeah. So maybe I'll do the first part of
Hmm.
your, because it's
Hmm.
kind of a big question.
Yeah, yeah, a lot there.
Um, for me, one of the things that I'm most grateful for is that I started in Zen
Mm.
because it taught me how to get, well, to start to get out of the conceptual mind, to just drop all that and go to the breath over and over again. And so I had that skill. And even though I'd kind of gotten away from the Dharma, when I did encounter Tibetan Buddhism again, even though it was so heady and so intellectual, when I was introduced to the compassion practices, which are really the kind of the crowning jewel of Tibetan Buddhism's contribution to Buddhism, I think. I I was able to really go into them because I already knew how to calm and steady my mind through my Zen practice. So that to me was just a huge blessing. Um, my experience of meeting these compassion practices together with the philosophy was I just became completely like lit up and on fire. And I was definitely like obsessed. I went to, I became like the teacher's assistant. I graded the papers. I started studying Tibetan language. I and then of Tibetan language, I was taking classes a couple days a week, and then I was going to seminars at our teacher's house on the weekend. I was going to a tiny little temple in Chinatown where the Tibetan language teacher was teaching. I was doing Dharma and language and philosophy almost every day of the week. It just resonated. And then at the same time, because I was so on fire with it, I was practicing for hours and hours. So I would do like on Saturday morning, I'd wake up and I'd do yoga for like 2.5 hours and then I'd practice for 2 hours. Um, and yeah, I feel like, I don't know, it was a really special time for me. And that's when I started going to India. And as I kind of moved through the Tibetan system, I slowly was introduced to the Vajrayana. And then things started to slow down because you have to just get a lot slower because it gets deep very quickly. And then yeah, so in terms of Nundro, so Nundro is a Tibetan term that means preliminaries.
Mhm.
So traditionally, one would do a set of preliminaries to um, both to prepare the mind and body kind of complex for these really expedient, admittedly advanced Vajrayana or tantric practices, and also as a means of purification. So one thing that I always make a link to is the so Ashtanga Yoga, which you mentioned earlier, has several series, and the first series is really about purifying the inner channels. And I always think of Nundro as similar to that first series in Ashtanga of about purifying and preparing the body for more advanced yoga.
Mhm.
So, in the way I experienced and was exposed to Gelug Buddhism, Nundro was not, slash, maybe is not in general, as stressed as it is in the other traditions.
Mhm.
I don't know anyone in the Gelug tradition who did Nundro before getting advanced tantric initiations or empowerments. However, I do know many serious Gelug practitioners who then double back and do Nundro kind of alongside of their tantric practice.
Mhm.
Um, so I've kind of done it, I've done parts of it like that. That said, there are these teachings in the Nyingma tradition that I really want to practice, and Nundro is a requirement for those. That said, it's a different type of Nundro. It's not a Nundro that's focused on accumulating certain numbers of, say, refuge prayers or prostrations. It's about the time you spend doing the practices,
Mhm.
which I think is really beautiful and gets at what I understand to be the real essence of Nundro, which is not accumulating vast amounts of repetitions, but about the inner transformative process that a mind goes through by doing very strong, very foundational practices.
Mhm. You touched on it a little bit so far, but I would be curious to hear kind of more about, obviously yoga was very important for you through different stages of your practice. And um, how do you think about that now? How does it affect your practice now? And not just, I know there's the asana, there's the element of the physical practice, but also like, do you engage with the kind of spiritual or the like the there's a lot of different traditions or origin points for the kind of yoga tradition in India, but how do you engage with that, and how does it influence you now?
Yeah, I've never been super interested in the yogic kind of spiritual lineages.
Mm.
I've always I've just been like a Buddhist girl. Like as soon as I met Buddhism, I was just like, this is it. Um, and it's not to say that I'm not interested in them. I just it wasn't a natural proclivity, and I haven't had the time. Although I do hope to go back and learn more.
Mm.
But one thing that's really interesting about yoga and Buddhism, and probably really specifically Vajrayana, that I'm just starting to realize is, like I said, well, I don't know if I really drew this out. I was doing so much yoga when I first met Tibetan Buddhism. And I was regularly being just like turned inside out. I kind of like intensive yoga. So like multiple hours a day with top teachers. It wasn't like going to a yoga, dropping into a yoga class. Like this was like very real deal, deep yoga. And yeah, I mean, I couldn't speak after the classes. I would have to like go home and take a nap to like regulate my nervous system. And then once I started practicing Vajrayana, my yoga practice went way down. And
Mm.
it basically dried up for many years because I couldn't, both were so strong and so transformative. I couldn't do them at the same time. And it's only in retrospect that I think that's why I stopped doing yoga. But so I did this massive amount of yoga, then I stopped, then I started working on Vajrayana and Tantra. And the whole time I was feeling guilty that I had sort of lost my yoga practice. But then I realized I didn't have the kind of capacity to do both. And it's just maybe in the past year or something, I've started to really integrate them together again, which
Mm.
I take as a sign of like healing and improvement.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, given my my experience of both too. Well, we can move on a little bit to the domain of teaching, or the sort of uh, traditional style of teaching versus how I know a number of Vajrayana teachers are starting to experiment. And be curious, kind of where do you see yourself going, or what's inspiring you in terms of uh, the direction of how you want to approach teaching? And it's a big question, but um,
Yeah, I
uh,
feel exposed in an exciting way. Well, I'll trace back how I started teaching because it also goes back to yoga.
Mhm.
Um, so I was assisting my yoga teacher a lot, and she ran these yoga teacher trainings. And she used to have Sharon Salzberg would come in and do the meditation portion of the teacher trainings.
Mhm.
And one year Sharon got sick; she had the flu. So my teacher asked me to step in and do the module, which was terrifying. Like I was filling in with Sharon Salzberg, like what? And because my teacher knew, like, because I was her student, she gave me this list of all the questions she's never been able to answer. And this was like before mindfulness had really started to come into popular culture. So she gave me this list of questions like, what's the difference between mindfulness and concentration? What's the difference between mindfulness and awareness? And just this, I don't know, very detailed list. And I was studying translation with Bob Thurman at the time, and I sent him the list. And he very kindly wrote out this big 3-page email answering all my questions from this very high level, um, which I obviously drew a lot of my teaching and thought from. So that's how I started. Just my yoga teacher asked me to start teaching. And then I regularly started teaching for the not only her yoga teacher trainings, but other yoga teacher trainings. I became like the person that would be brought in for the meditation aspect. Um, and then I started studying with a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and he also was encouraging me to teach and was giving me a lot of direction and how to do that, and was mentoring me in the process of teaching. And I would say for many years, but it's actually still the case now. I mean, primarily what I teach is compassion, because I mean the topic of the upcoming Dharma Gates retreat, it's an intro to Vajrayana, but it's compassion as the basis of Vajrayana.
Mm.
So most, if not all, of my teaching is on compassion. How do we train in it kind of cognitively? How do we train in it emotionally so that we're not bypassing? How do we work with our body in terms of developing compassion? And all of those skills are exactly what you need to work with the Vajrayana.
Mhm.
But I'm not like giving Vajrayana initiations or teaching Vajrayana like that. That's a different level of practitioner and realization that I don't have yet. I very much aspire to, have all the realizations. Um, but yeah, so I'm more helping people develop a really, I hope, a very strong foundation, because that is what I believe has served me best.
Mm. I'm curious to, I guess, uh, dig a little bit deeper into sort of what you just shared, which is, it seems like core, one of the core elements of Vajrayana, at least as I've seen it, kind of in the West, a lot of the offerings are what's called empowerments. What is an empowerment? Because it's not
Yeah.
in Theravada, it's not in Zen, and be curious to hear that kind of in your words or your understanding. What does that mean?
Yeah, totally. So like this gets esoteric, right? I'm just gonna put that out there. So the in the way that I understand it, I hope I can do justice to this. What an empowerment really is, it's when a teacher reveals or points to your essential nature. And when a teacher can do that in many different ways, they can do it with a look, they can do it with a Dharma teaching, it can happen over a cup of tea. Um, it can happen in a dream, even, although that's even more subtle. Um, or it can happen in a highly ritualized way. And Vajrayana or tantric empowerment is typically a very ritualized way of giving the student the first taste of like a of an open mind or direct experience.
Mm.
And what I think is very confusing for us is in the West is A, we don't even understand that. And B, all we see is this weird, super complicated ritual, often done in another language, often done with zero explanation, where you're just asked to repeat stuff in Tibetan. You don't even know the words you're saying. It's like gobbledygook. You're like, blah, 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 blah. Um, but none of that is the essence of it. There's something really pregnant and vibrant that's kind of like happening in the room at the time, and that's the essence of the transmission. So in order to do certain practices, they're called sadhanas, they're practices, um, you often, not always, but you often need an empowerment or an introduction in order to be able to do that practice. The idea is that if you don't have the living link from the teacher, if they don't kind of pass on that energetic juice to you, even if you just do the practice, nothing will come of it because no one gave you the spark.
Mm.
Does that make sense? So,
Mhm.
yeah, a lot of times these tantric initiations or empowerments, and those words are used interchangeably. They're what enable you to do a practice or even to read a practice or to say certain mantras.
Mm. Seems like it's hard to avoid at some point like an element of I don't know if magic's the right word, but something close
Yes.
in the Vajrayana tradition. It's and to be honest, this is in Zen too, completely. But it's a little bit more you can ignore it. You can be in denial about it. In Zen. Whereas in Vajrayana, it seems like the more in your face or more just the nature of the things that there's something mysterious about how it's even transmitted at all, or how it even like is practiced at all.
Yeah. And my heart is like fluttering as you say it. 'Cause I'm like, yes, yes. There's actually a really beautiful book that just came out. It's called The Magic of Vajrayana by Ken
Mm,
MacLeod. I
mm,
really like Ken MacLeod as a thinker. Yeah, he's highly trained and very yeah, I just really resonate with the way he thinks. Um, but yes, there is a magic element, and well, two things. I mean, so the Gaelic tradition, just to give you a little background on it, it's the newest of the four Tibetan schools, and it's a reform school. And part of how it came about was it came about in response to the perceived excesses of tantric Buddhism. So
mm,
they're like, well, we got to like rein this in and get back to monastic vows and get back to very basic sutra slash Mahayana teachings.
mm,
And it also, in addition to those, as I said, is just super scholastic and heady and intellectual. So, in my experience in Vajrayana and the Gelug tradition, the magic wasn't really like drawn out or widely acknowledged there.
mm,
Um, in fact, I remember being at this super high level tantric teaching and someone saying, "This is like magic, right?" And the Lama just sort of like not even picking it up. But it is like magic. But the way it's kind of approached in Gaelic, which I think is very interesting, and you'll see this in all the Tibetan schools, although Gaelic exemplifies it really well, or like to the highest degree, maybe, is that the magic is all based on philosophical tenets. So you learn the philosophy that makes magic make sense.
mm, mm,
And in that way, it kind of stops being as magical potentially if you
mm,
just focus on why philosophically it's makes sense and is logical or something. But to really move forward in your Vajrayana practice, you must be in touch with the magic. Another word we could use for magic is energy or
yeah.
vitality or spark. It means it's alive. And yes, it means it's beyond logic in the same way that so much of our reality is beyond logic and alive and magical, but we don't even stop to think about it, you know? I mean, nature is astounding, right? It's not really logical.
It's interesting thinking of it. It's sort of magic in that it's beyond our usual categories, our usual ways of seeing, but um
Exactly. But
but
there is something kind of innately magic about it too. It's both, right? Sorry,
yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, it seems like at bare minimum, the Tibetans play with this quality much more than kind of in the Theravada, which there is magic in the Theravada tradition, but it's treated very differently. It's like in my understanding, it feels like in many ways, like an accidental byproduct of spiritual practice, where in the Tibetan tradition, it's more, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it's actually utilizing the power of like energetic practices and the power of prayer and the power of all of these things that we might think of as magic actually towards the kind of directly for the purpose of awakening. So,
Yes. And the reason it's so effective is because it more closely aligns with how reality actually is, which is
mm,
vast and limitless and just absolute limitless potential,
mm,
which we think of as magic because we can't conceive beyond our usual box of thinking. So then anything, you said this earlier, anything outside of it becomes magic to us. But if you open the box, it's just all within it. And this just happens to be a really fast way.
it makes sense. It seems it's somewhat similar to, well, it seems like a lot of my understanding of the Mahayana in general is just, what if we start, what if we started practicing from the perspective of realizations? Rather than practicing from the perspective of an individual. And that's a lot of the Zen tradition is
Yeah,
kind of,
that's interesting. I mean, in the Tibetan traditions, they talk about practicing from, how did you say it? You said it so nicely.
well, from like practicing from the perspective of realization kind of will
Yeah,
will work better than pretending you're a self from the very beginning and then trying to dismantle that self. It's like if you just pretend you're not.
exactly. So that's
Mhm.
really how in the Tibetan lineages they talk about the tantric path, where
Mhm.
you practice feeling and experiencing the world as if you were already a Buddha.
Mhm.
Um, or right, as if you're already enlightened or awakened, which yes, it is also part of Zen. And it's funny because I hadn't thought of that as like a Mahayana approach. I'd only thought of it as like a tantric approach. Um, but yeah, where Zen and certain traditions within the Vajrayana really overlap is in the idea of, because we all are kind of already there, we just can't see that we already are enlightened or have all these enlightened qualities, that the experience of waking up can be quite immediate and spontaneous, right? And the methods of acting like you're already there, there's a link there.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I'm curious. So maybe moving on to a next kind of broader topic, which is, I've been interested in Vajrayana for a while, but really started in Zen, and I'm sort of lineage confused right now as I'm practicing in Theravada too. So,
Cool.
but one of the things that I think deterred me for a long time was in the Zen world, there's a lot of places you can go and you just go and hang out there and start doing what they're doing. And it generally it's easy to sort that out. I know a lot of places where if someone wants to go to a Zen monastery, I know where to tell them to go. And it's not quite as easy in the Theravada, but there are some places. But in the Vajrayana, it feels a little more I don't really know like how people are, what's the roadmap for like building a practice, or how does someone does it seems like it almost has to come from one's karma. You just meet some teacher somewhere who just it drops the right word in your ear at the right time, and then you go to this place and then suddenly it all unfolds. And maybe that's just the game, but I'm curious, like for anyone who has some interest in the Vajrayana but doesn't really know how to like what to do next, what would you tell them?
Well, there certainly are, a lot of Tibetan Dharma centers. So I think that would be a good place to start, is look for a Tibetan Dharma center, either, in your area, or that has like a robust online training and community that you can tap into, because you really do need the community. The Sangha is part of it. And then from there, the the Tibetan Buddhist approach will always give you a firm foundation in their flavor of Mahayana and the compassion practices, before you are encouraged to attend your first empowerment or start doing any of the so-called Vajrayana. So a couple kind of big accessible online communities. There's Mingyur Rinpoche's Tergar community, which has a really wonderful systematic training and is very accessible online. Um, I practice with a community called Tara Mandala, which really has a strong emphasis on the sacred feminine. But both those communities are giving are really developing practitioners potentially for Vajrayana, if that's your interest. But it's not just like being dropped into Vajrayana practice because it really is quite advanced. You really want a strong foundation. What you said initially about being kind of lineage confused and practicing in Zen and Theravada and having an interest in the Vajrayana, I think that this is, it's not only, I think this is what Buddhism in America is going to look like. And to some extent already does look like, but it's not quite there yet. So I think that's very beautiful. And it's something that I would really encourage. And I think it's also really necessary because there is so much sectarianism within the Dharma of people thinking that Theravada is good, but Vajrayana is bad, and vice versa. And everyone's so attached to, not everyone, but many people are so attached to their lineage and their way. And I think the more that we can educate ourselves in the variety of traditions and actually practice in them, um, yeah, the better off we're all going to be.
I've been joking somewhat with some of the other members of the Dharma Gates staff recently that, we have this whole nonprofit now where we're trying to connect a lot of people to different Buddhist teachers, but it seems to be having the effect on all the staff where we're meeting all these amazing teachers from all these lineages, and it's like, what do we do? It seems like there's all these different flavors of uh, awakening that are equally compelling in various ways, or like my experience right now, recently, has been that it's hard to buy the story that any one of them is the like real superior one, because then you go meet
Totally.
some other teacher who's just completely amazing in a completely different way, and you're like, wow, I don't know if I can do all of these, but I want I want to.
Yeah, no, we shouldn't buy it. That's such a silly story, right? No, the idea is to find the lineages and practices, paths that are the right fit for our minds.
Mm,
And that's going to change. Yeah. I mean, one thing that is cool about Tibetan Buddhism is that it some are less stressed than others. Um, but it is that kind of all the lineages. I mean, you can't say Zen's in there or something, but many of the practice techniques are also included within Tibetan Buddhism.
mhm,
And so you might be a Vajrayana practitioner, but then you might stop and just do very classic mindfulness for certain periods because that's what you need,
mhm,
or really work with spontaneous awakening through Zen practice or something.
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
But yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just struck by in the Nyondro course that uh I've been starting exploring. Um, they describe that one of the core practices of Nyondro is cultivating bodhicitta, which is, there's the classical, it's part of the prostrations, it's one of the techniques, but it was like, and a part of cultivating bodhicitta is cultivating the four immeasurables and the six perfections, which is, for those that don't know, that's loving kindness, equanimity, sympathetic joy, compassion, And then the six perfections are essentially the whole Mahayana and Theravada tradition. Like it's just one of these parts of the Nyondo is actually opens up in all directions as the entire rest of the Buddhist tradition. So really you
Totally.
got your hands full with the preliminaries there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's why they're not, it's funny. I mean, Nundra means preliminary. Okay, that's what it means, but it's not great to actually think about it as preliminary because as you said, this is the whole path. What's inside of these specific practices and techniques. And it's not that, oh, you do a certain number or a certain time of these practices and then you're done. You've graduated from that. You don't go back to them. No, of course, there's going to be other times in your life where you do the prostrations or you do serious refuge practice or something because your mind will tell you or your teacher there's some block or something you need to go back to
Mhm.
that.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm curious. So, what's what are you excited about in your practice or in the kind of Western Dharma world right now? Are there projects? Are there things that you are excited to get involved in or want to be doing or are doing that you want to share about?
Sure. I mean, I'm this is a little vague, but I'm very excited about American Buddhism and Western Buddhism in general becoming what I'll just call sort of like interdisciplinary with all the different lineages and people gaining not just respect, but real familiarization with the different lineages, because that's like the seed of respect, right?
Mhm.
That's super exciting to me. Um, in terms of like how my own practice and where things are going and dovetailing, I've started to work a little bit with Dzogchen and with non-dual traditions, and there's many non-dual traditions. But right now I'm mostly working with Dzogchen, and Dzogchen is traditionally presented as the pinnacle of the Vajrayana traditions within Tibetan Buddhism. Like there are no higher, not only teachings and practices, but it's the most expansive worldview as found in Dzogchen. And so traditionally, just like regular Vajrayana, one works up to it. And it's after a strong Vajrayana practice and the qualities that one develops through that, that you would then be introduced into Dzogchen, maybe, right? Um, but what's really fascinating to me is some people are starting to teach Dzogchen and Mahamudra, very similar to Dzogchen, both considered pinnacle teachings, very openly. And to people who don't have this traditional background. And what's happening is people are having realization right there, right out of the blue. And
Mhm.
to me, that is just extraordinary, right? It's like, so that there's something there that I'm very interested to see where it's going to go, how the masters of our day and age they are working with it right now very directly, how they'll continue working with it and how future realized practitioners in the Western context, if they're going to keep going in that direction, and if so, what that looks like. That's exciting to me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Seems like a kind of the broader topic of the opening of the kind of esoteric parts of the tradition or the parts that have been like had many, many layers of being guarded or protected is a really interesting event. Yeah, don't know how it's gonna how it's gonna go.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Well, I think we could move towards wrapping things up. So I guess I'd be curious, what are you offering kind of realistically, like in the near term? And do you have students? Do people work with you via Zoom or in person? Or What are your kind of offerings? How should people get involved with keep track of your teachings if they're interested?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I work with a variety of students through one-on-one mentorship, which is I love that. Part of the reason I mean, okay, I like it because it's everyone's so different, and I get to bring like my full creativity and like knowledge, background, and intuition into the moment to kind of connect with people individually and help them find Dharma teachings and paths that really work with them. That's very fun to me. That's one reason I really like working one on one. Another reason I like it is because there's there's something really special that happens when we allow someone to get to know us. It opens the Dharma practice up in different ways that I think is magical actually.
Mhm.
And it has a correlation with Tibetan Buddhism in terms of having a direct relationship with a teacher. And mentorship is one way to sort of skirt around that or explore that. So yeah, I work with people one on one. I give retreats. We have the Dharma Gates retreat coming up in March, and I do pilgrimages with Tricycle Buddhist Review, which for those of you that don't know, it's like the oldest Buddhist magazine in America. Now it's like bigger than a magazine, but there's lots of interdisciplinary, interlineage teachings found on Tricycle. So I lead international pilgrimages like to India and Mongolia and things with them. I also lead my own retreats, and my retreats are really kind of, you know, the way we in the West have kind of inherited the retreat tradition. It's still coming out of a monastic structure. So monastics, their whole life is quasi retreat, right? They're like living the Dharma. And then for them, retreat is this period of intense practice. But for us, we're not coming from a place, most of us, of fully living the Dharma all the time. So when we go into retreat, it can feel very, it can make us a little tense to do such intense practice. So the way I like to do retreats is to have them be much more open and spacious, where there's yoga and there's downtime for integration, and the practices are really deep and condensed. I'm really into getting at the essential aspects of practice and teachings. So, and that's like one of my passions. How can we create retreat experiences where there's not a sense of tension or rigidity or like I've got to do this, I've got to like amp up to do it, but everything's really spacious and yet very deep and effective. And then my newest project that I'm really excited about is once a month at Tibet House in New York City, and this will become a hybrid offering over Zoom as well, although we're starting it in person. Um, I have something that's called Dharma Friends. And the idea behind Dharma Friends is it's donation based, and it's a place for people to come together in person for Dharma talks, meditation, but we're also bringing in art and music and embodiment. And the Dharma talks and the meditation are something that's a given every month, but the art and the music and the embodiment, that all changes so that it's something like really fresh every month, but also something sort of reliable and traditional in a way there. And the both the Dharma and the meditations are almost always grounded in compassion.
Mm.
Um, and all of the stuff you can find on my website,
Which
which is
is
my name, meganmook.com.
meganmook.com.
Yeah,
Right.
it's Mook like book.
Mook, Megan Mook.
Yeah,
Great, great.
meganmook.com.
Um, Wonderful. Yeah, no, that's all great. I hope people follow up on that. Set up some interviews or I have one more question. So you mentioned Tergar, which is Mingyur Rinpoche's community, and Taramandala, which is I think Lama Tsultrim Alione is the teacher.
Yep, exactly.
Um, and yeah, are there any other communities that people might check out depending where they are in the US that you'd really recommend in terms of the Tibetan Buddhist practice?
No, I mean those are two that I know that have large reach and that
Yeah.
I know I really trust the teachers and the methodology there.
Hmm.
Um, Again, I would look to centers like in your own community. Like just,
Hmm.
do a search for Tibetan centers in your own community. And then also something that you can always do is you can send me an email or another seasoned practitioner and just run it by them. Hey, I found this Tibetan Buddhist center. Do you mind taking a look at the teachers and the lineage?
Hmm.
Something like that is really helpful because you can't, if you don't know, you don't know, and you can't, they might list the lineage, but you don't actually know what those teachers mean or what the history or the background is. So I do think it's important if you can to sort of check it out with someone else before you get too deep, you know?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
like I said, I'm happy to be a resource for that.
Hmm. Great, great. All right. Well, I think that's a good time to close things up. So I just want to say thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. It's great to learn a little bit more about your practice, and um, yeah, I hope this conversation was beneficial for some folks. For anybody who's listening, if you're not subscribed to Dharma Gate's newsletter, you can subscribe on our website. We share a lot of things, including our upcoming retreat with Megan, and many other retreats and cool Dharma things that you can find out about. That's probably the main way to stay involved or hear more about what we're doing. There's obviously a lot more things on our website too, which is dharma-gates.org. So with that, I'll end the recording and